C.B. Muthamma, born on the 24th of January 1924, was the first woman to join the Indian Foreign Service. She was a noted diplomat in many areas in Asia, Africa, and Europe, serving as India's ambassador to Hungary and to The Hague. Muthamma was the pioneer in fighting for gender equality in the Indian civil service, which was heavily male-dominated in her time. She went to court challenging discriminatory rules which prevented women from rising to the top of the foreign service, and also had clauses which demanded that women in the foreign service seek special permission before marriage. Her case was upheld in 1979 in a landmark judgment by a 3-member bench, with the court emphasizing the need to overhaul all service rules to remove the stains of sex discrimination. Since then, women have been able to reach the highest rank, that of Foreign Secretary in the Indian Foreign Service. And to celebrate C.B. Muthamma's incredible life and achievements, the second C.B. Muthamma Memorial Lecture is being given by Ambassador Asoke Mukerji, the former permanent representative of India to the United Nations and a noted columnist.
I would like to thank Global Order and Hindol and Rishi for inviting me to deliver the second C.B. Muthamma lecture. The first C.B. Muthamma lecture delivered by Ambassador Nirupama Rao had focused on C.B. Muthamma as a person, a foreign service professional who used the principle of gender equality to demand and get justice from the Indian bureaucratic system. And I think in that lecture we also saw the impact that C.B. Muthamma had as a role model for succeeding generations of Indian women diplomats. Today I propose in the second C.B. Muthamma lecture to expand a bit on the principle of gender equality and look at it in terms of how it evolved internationally around the same time that C.B. Muthamma and independent India began participating actively in international relations. So this narrative would have 3 broad parts. The first is how the UN Charter, which had references to equal rights for men and women and had a commitment to equal human rights for men and women, was then implemented and made a living document. And in that part of the narrative, we would look at the evolution of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the creation of the Commission on the Status of Women. So these were the 2 institutional initiatives that were taken in the international context on gender equality. Along with this, and that's the third part of what I propose to deal with, is how these ideas actually took root on the ground, and what were the outcomes that happened because of the activism that accompanied this process. And finally, I conclude the lecture by talking of some of the challenges that are faced internationally on implementing gender equality. Now, when we start looking at how the United Nations looked at gender equality, in the Charter itself, in the preamble, there's a reference to equal rights for men and women, and there is an expectation that even in terms of people employed by the United Nations, there would be equality of opportunity and jobs. So that's in the Charter. But when the Charter was finalized and adopted on the 26th of June 1945, there was not much more in terms of a substantive commitment to gender equality. That happened after the Charter was adopted and came into force during the first session of the UN General Assembly, which met in 1946 in London. And on the 23rd of January 1946, Sir Arcot Ramaswamy Mudaliar of India was elected the first president of the Economic and Social Council, of the United Nations. The Economic and Social Council is one of the 6 organs created by the UN Charter for multilateral institutions. And it was under Sir Arkot Ramaswamy Mudaliar's presidency that on the 16th of February 1946, the Commission on Human Rights was established. Now, the Economic and Social Council, which is known as the ECOSOC, has a mandate in Article 68 of the UN Charter to set up commissions to further areas which are referred to in the UN Charter. And since human rights was referred to in the UN Charter, the Commission on Human Rights was established to take this idea forward. It did some very interesting work during its first 2 years when India presided over the ECOSOC. The Commission on Human Rights was chaired by the widow of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had died in 1945, just before the charter was negotiated and signed. Eleanor Roosevelt was the president of the Commission on Human Rights. And she had a series of advisors and delegates who were representing their countries in the UN General Assembly to discuss on how to take forward creating a structure, an international structure for human rights. Now, there's a fascinating discussion in the UN archives on the 2 options that were before the Commission on Human Rights. One was to create a legally binding treaty on human rights. And the other was to create an international Bill of Rights as a declaration and use the declaration to encourage member states of the United Nations to formulate their own laws on human rights. Eventually, after discussions and even consultations with Sir Ramaswamy Mudaliar, the Commission on Human Rights decided to opt for the second option, and they started work on negotiating what eventually has come to be known today as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It is not a treaty, it is not legally binding, but it is normative in the sense that it contains the principles on which member states would be drafting and adopting national legislation to give substance to human rights. This work was completed on the 10th of December 1948, which is marked globally as the Human Rights Day. In the negotiation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 2 Indian women played a very important role, and this has been recognized publicly by the United Nations itself. One was Hansa Mehta. Hansa Mehta was a political activist from India who was sent to participate in the discussions of the Commission on Human Rights. And in the process of these discussions, she is credited by the United Nations itself with proposing that the original draft formulation of Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which at that time read, "All men are born equal," should be replaced, the word men should be replaced by all human beings. And when she was asked as to why this was necessary, she said that this was necessary because men and women had equal rights. And in the conversations that took place in the United Nations General Assembly during those years of 1947 and 48, there are others, delegates, who have left their own memoirs in which they have actually dwelt at how Hansa Mehta shared the experience of having participated in the Indian freedom movement on an equal basis, shoulder to shoulder with men to get the independence of India. And this kind of political activism, therefore, gave her a certain credential, a credibility, and eventually Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does read that all human beings are born free and equal. The other lady who from India who played a big role in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was Lakshmi Menon. Lakshmi Menon was an educationist, and at the same time she was politically active. And in the period just leading up to India's independence, she had been publicly asking for equal rights for political representation of women. This was the theme which she brought into the discussions when the UN General Assembly's third committee, which deals with human rights, met to discuss the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And she is the one who is responsible for including the equality of men and women into the preamble of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Lakshmi Menon and Hansa Mehta today are role models for many in developing countries who look to how to pursue the agenda of gender equality using the forms of governance, of legislation, and of implementing legislation. Lakshmi Menon later was inducted by Jawaharlal Nehru as Deputy Minister of External Affairs. And in the archive records, we read about her role as a firefighter for Jawaharlal Nehru, including up to the 1962 war with China. After Nehru's death, she went back to Kerala and did not participate actively in Indian political life, but she carried on her role as activist for women's equality until her death. So this was the first process that happened. The second process, area where the UN Charter commitments on gender equality were pushed, was in the Economic and Social Council, which when it created the Commission on Human Rights, also created a sub-commission on the status of women. So in terms of the structure of the United Nations, the issue of the status of women was made of a lower priority than the consideration of human rights, for which there was a full commission. There were three ladies, political activists from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, who felt that the status of women needed to be considered on par with the status of human rights, and therefore a full commission should be formed in the United Nations system for the status of women. So between 1946, when the Commission on Human Rights and the Subcommission on Status of Women was formed, till 1948, this process of negotiating within the United Nations system to raise the structure to the level of a commission preoccupied these activists from these three Scandinavian countries. In the process, they interacted with delegates who are already in the United Nations General Assembly to pursue the objective of gender equality. And three names are mentioned by them in their memoirs. One is, of course, Hansa Mehta, about whom we know from her role in the Commission on Human Rights. The other two are from the Dominican Republic, Minerva Bernardino, and from Brazil, Berta Lutz. In fact, Berta Lutz of Brazil is credited for having inserted the word women into the UN Charter itself during the San Francisco negotiations. So these group of women activists worked through the UN system with member states and eventually persuaded the member states to agree to raise the status of the subcommission to that of a full commission. In 1947, the full commission on the status of women, known as the CSW, met with 15 members. And what made it distinctive was that all 15 members were women. And this was something that happened by coincidence, but it happened nevertheless. And it gave a huge profile to the work on the status of women, which was to be undertaken in the United Nations by this new structure that had been created. The Commission on Status of Women had four big priorities: political rights, citizenship rights, education, and employment. So these were the four areas which they prioritized. And when they started work on these four areas, they realized that they needed political support and will to push these ideas forward on a sustainable basis. And as with all ideas which need to be sustained, they worked on having a legal framework to create obligations on members of the United Nations to adopt laws to further the process of the status of women in these four areas. The first success of the Commission on the Status of Women came in 1953 when they were able to have a UN Convention on the Political Status of Women adopted, and that was followed in 1956 by women's rights in marriage and women's rights for education. But the biggest achievement of the Commission on the Status of Women came in 1979. In 1979, the Commission enabled the adoption of the Convention to outlaw discrimination on women globally. And this convention is known by its acronym CEDAW, which is the Commission for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And it is on the basis of CEDAW that the global movement towards gender equality then proceeded on a structured basis with a framework of a legal convention. The next big watershed for that process of gender equality came in 1975, which was declared as the International Women's Year by the United Nations. And it was also the year in which the first global conference on women was held in Mexico City. That aroused a wider movement of trying to push a global agenda for gender equality. And what helped matters was the fact that being a commission on the status of women, the body had the mandate to work within the framework of the Economic and Social Council and to engage with a lot of non-governmental organizations which had been given consultative status within the United Nations system. So the commission, which had its own ideas, was able to get ideas from the ground through these non-governmental organizations and put together a more holistic and realistic program of action for making gender equality a reality in different parts of the member states, countries of the United Nations. That's how the process came to a head in 1995 at the 4th Conference of Women, which was held in Beijing in China, and which adopted the Beijing Platform and Action Plan for Women. Till today, from 1995 onwards, all the evolution of gender equality issues that have taken place in a global framework are based on the template of the Beijing Plan of Action. And this process moved with the turn of the century into a more focused activity, which resulted in 2010 in the creation of an entity in the United Nations system called UN Women. And UN Women brought together the different strands of political activism, pushing for equal rights for men and women in different areas of work of the United Nations and the members of the United Nations who had agreed on this program of work. The first president of UN Women was the former president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, and the first deputy executive head of UN Women was Ambassador Lakshmi Puri of India. Now, today the UN Women as a secretariat plays the role of implementing the discussions that take place on the Commission on the Status of Women. So there is a convergence which has taken place, and that is the second big sort of outcome of the process of gender equality in the United Nations. Now, moving to the substance of what has been discussed in terms of gender equality, I think we need to take a step back and go back to the 1960s when, for the first time, the United Nations system itself underwent a major transformation. And that was the completion of the process of decolonization, which resulted in a vast majority of the countries represented in the United Nations being former colonies, and grouped together as the Group of 77 Developing Countries. In 1964, the G77 was formed in the United Nations, and one of their major demands was to have an appropriate interface in the UN system for demands of development to be pursued in a coherent manner. And in response, the UN General Assembly created the United Nations Development Programme in 1965, and today the UNDP is a name which is recognized instantly in more than 170 countries of the United Nations system. When we looked at the evolution of human rights and gender equality through the initiatives taken in the 50s and 60s, then I think in the 70s we come across a new synergy that comes into effect in terms of gender equality. And it comes into effect not because of gender equality per se, but it comes into effect because of the intellectual framework in which rights of men and women are being discussed. And the intellectual framework is set by two events that happened in 1967 and 1972. In 1967, the Group of 77 adopts the Charter of Algiers, which prioritizes the creation of a new international economic order. And because in many developing countries, women have participated on an equal basis for independence from colonial rule, the concept of gender equality comes in as part of demands for socio-economic development. In 1972, the UN hosts the first conference on the human environment in Stockholm, and that introduces into the international discussion the concept of climate change and environmental protection. Initially, these two concepts of development and environment are seen to be contradictory, but it takes an empowered woman from India, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, to merge the two. And in a famous statement which she makes in Stockholm in 1972, that poverty is the biggest polluter. So without addressing poverty and equal rights of men and women in overcoming poverty, we cannot sustain environmental protection. And in 1987, so 15 years later, it is another empowered woman leader, Prime Minister Brundtland from Norway, who tables the Brundtland Report, which for the first time introduces the concept of sustainable development into the international matrix. Now, women's rights and the role of women in sustainable development is something that is emphasized very directly in the Brundtland Report, which is tabled in 1987, and which forms the basis on which in 1992 the international community, the Cold War has ended, starts working on the agenda for what we today call sustainable development. It starts with the UN summit in Rio in 1992, which is often known as the Earth Summit, and moves on through a series of processes up to September 2015, when the United Nations adopts its agenda on sustainable development called Agenda 2030. But in terms of gender equality, it is useful to recall that emphasis on the role of women, on the importance of women's rights, on gender equality is very much part of the process on sustainable development negotiations. And in fact, in the year 2000, the Secretary General of the United Nations formulates 8 development goals, which he calls the Millennium Development Goals, which are applied only to developing countries. And out of these 8 goals, at least 3 or 4 of them are devoted to women and to gender equality. Issues like health, like education, gender equality are already part of the Millennium Development Goals. And when these goals are seen to fall short because they cannot be implemented without resources, since they were formulated from the top down by the Secretary General and his advisors, then the experience of implementing such an ambitious enterprise is taken in hand by delegates from all countries who meet in Rio de Janeiro again in 2012. and agreed to negotiate Agenda 2030 on sustainable development between 2013 and 2015. So when we look at Agenda 2030, which is today the global blueprint for socio-economic development as well as environmental protection, we see that the Sustainable Development Goal 1 is eradication of poverty, which in a sense validates what Indira Gandhi had said in 1972, that poverty is the biggest polluter. But it goes on to have a standalone goal, SDG 5, on gender equality. And I think that this is something that when we look at how the international community has taken forward the idea of gender equality, we need to appreciate the context, the holistic way in which this whole issue is today being addressed. Now, Agenda 2030 is a very ambitious agenda. It is also one of the biggest achievements of the United Nations system, because what was not mentioned in the UN Charter, or mentioned only fleetingly, of socio-economic development and upholding fundamental human rights and freedoms, has come into the center stage. And the Agenda 2030 itself says that without peace and security, there can be no development, and without development, there can be no peace and security. So in a way, the issues of development, which includes gender equality, are today an integral part of even the reforms of the political structures of the United Nations. We can see this process at work in the United Nations Secretariat, where for several years, more than a decade now, attempts have been made to show gender equality and to insist on raising the number of women who are employed within the United Nations Secretariat. As I mentioned right at the beginning of this lecture, in the Charter itself, there is a commitment that there will be equality in employment in the United Nations for men and women. So in the last two elections for the UN Secretary General's post, women candidates have actually made a very, very determined effort to be elected to the top job as UN Secretary General. This process has not yet given results, but I think the time is not far away from when we will see the first woman Secretary General of the United Nations. On the part of the member states of the General Assembly, however, women have been able to get elected as President of the General Assembly. And here too, India has taken a pioneering role, because it was in 1953 that India proposed the name of Vijay Lakshmi Pandit as the next President of the General Assembly. And she was elected as President of the General Assembly, and she worked closely with the then UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld in literally changing the way people were looking at the UN at a time when the Cold War had erupted between the two major powers of the time, and the vast majority of people who are not part of the two major powers and their populations were looking for the meaning of what the United Nations stood for. And it was in those early days of the 1950s that the process of development started getting focused upon. Many in that period remembered the speech by Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, which she had made in the United Nations in 1947 when she headed the Indian delegation just after independence, when she said that there are attempts to force us as newly independent countries to take sides in this new Cold War or this new ideological war that has come. But our priorities are priorities of food, clothing and shelter. Now, these are the words that were used by Vijay Lakshmi Pandit in 1947 September. And when she became President of the General Assembly in 1953, she did what she could within her power as the President of the General Assembly to push the issues of food, clothing, shelter, development into the agenda and offset the growing confrontation, military confrontation, armed force confrontation between the two blocs, something that President Eisenhower of the United States, when he handed over office in 1961, called the emergence of the military-industrial complex. So this is a contribution of Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, which I think has played a role in the way in which women can make a difference in the priorities being given in international affairs today. And I think it's the same focus that we see today when there is an outbreak of conflict and we are recovering from a pandemic, that there is a renewal of focus coming through women leaders from member states of the United Nations to refocus the UN on being relevant to people living in its member states, and that relevance comes from implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, having put this as the matrix, I think it's time to look at the challenges in the concluding part of this lecture. And I think the challenges are very clearly identified. In the summit on the Sustainable Development Goals, which took place in September 2023, recently in New York, all world leaders agreed that the process of implementing the Sustainable Development Goals is in peril. And the reason they gave for stating that this process is in peril is because of the numerous crises that have overtaken the system of global governance. And among the crises that have been identified are the impact of the unprecedented pandemic caused by COVID-19, as well as the proliferation of conflicts which have taken away resources earlier earmarked for sustainable development and channeled them towards armed conflict. And the impact of both of these on the status of people and especially of women across the world. So the first challenge is on overcoming the impact of the pandemic, and here the World Bank has identified in its first report issued in 2022 that the major impact of the pandemic has been on pushing almost 100 million people, mainly in developing countries, into extreme poverty, which means they are not able to earn more than $2.15 a day. And a vast number of this 100 million are women. So there's a priority which needs to be focused on how to get women to restructure their lives and to overcome the impact of this pandemic. The second is growing inequalities. The World Bank report has identified that if there are a certain fixed number of jobs available today in the economies around the world, then the preference is for men to get the jobs instead of the women. So how can the international community work to make women as employable in a post-COVID recovery as men? This is the big challenge which is facing the international community today. Then in terms of conflicts, already before the COVID pandemic struck, the impact of conflicts on women had been focused upon by the United Nations. In the year 2000, the United Nations Security Council had adopted a landmark resolution 1373, which is known as Women, Peace and Security. The objective of the United Nations Security Council resolution was to make women partners in ensuring peace as well as in building peace, because this was the vision that women had more stake in development and peace than in pursuing armed conflict. And India's own experience after the adoption of this resolution in 2000 has actually validated this approach. In 2007, India became the first country in the world, in the United Nations system, to contribute a full female unit of peacekeepers in Liberia. This is the first time any country, developed or developing, had introduced and deployed all women's contingent for peacekeeping in a volatile situation as prevailed in Liberia. At that time, 6% of Liberian women were looking to get employed as part of the Liberian security governance structures, police or law enforcement, etc. In 2016, when the deployment of the UN peacekeeping forces in Liberia had the impact and enable Liberia to transition to a political stable system, the president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, gave a public statement in which she identified the role of the Indian women peacekeepers as having contributed not only to the pacification of the conflict in Liberia, not only to the ability of Liberia to respond to the Ebola crisis, which had struck Liberia and two other African states in 2014, but also as role models for Liberian women to join the processes of governance and security. And the figure, which was 6% in 2007, went up to 16% of Liberian women joining the governance structures by the time the Indian women peacekeepers left Liberia. The more recent example is of South Sudan, where another country which was promised support through peacekeeping for development in 2011 got enmeshed in a violent civil war. And the main impact of that civil war was on the civilian population, 1/4 of whom were disrupted by the fighting, and most of the vulnerable were women and children. So India was a country when the peacekeeping operation was mandated in 2011 to contribute 1/4 of the troops required by the UN in South Sudan. And when South Sudan went into the civil war, it was the Indian troops who rose to the occasion, did not let the mandate restrict their ability to respond, and became the champions of the protection of civilians and the protection of women. And in South Sudan too, India is the country which has taken the initiative of deploying women peacekeepers. In January 2023, 5 of the Indian women peacekeepers were awarded medals by the United Nations in recognition of their contribution to keeping the peace as well as building peace, of building institutions. The engineer women from the Indian Army built infrastructure in South Sudan, bridges, roads, etc. The medical components of the Indian Armed Forces in South Sudan have built hospitals and therefore have shown that on an equal basis, as with male Indian troops, female Indian troops have been able to contribute to the process of restoring the societies which have been damaged by conflict. But I think that when we look at this process in closer home, then the biggest challenge that faces gender equality near us is in the SAARC country of Afghanistan, where from 15th of August 2021, half the population, which is 20 million women of Afghanistan, have been put under gender apartheid by the Taliban regime. And this is something that goes directly against the contribution of India made in the first decades of the 20th century, when after 9/11, when Afghanistan was promised support for rebuilding its structures by the United Nations, and the work which was done on the field by an eminent Indian woman activist, Ela Bhatt, who had introduced her organization SEWA, Self-Employment Women's Association, to introduce the concept of empowering women through employment and education. So SEWA was very active in Afghanistan, and there is a joint project between the United States and India which actually supports the work which was done by SEWA. But all that work went out of the window on the 15th of August 2021 with the arrival of an obscurantist regime which has legislated and passed laws depriving women of all the rights that were promised to them, not only nationally but also under the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the work done by the Commission on the Status of Women, which I spoke of. So this is a big challenge, and I think that it needs member states in the United Nations, including India, to take a proactive role to retrieve this situation. But I would like to conclude by mentioning two factors which illustrate the long journey on which gender equality has come in India itself. And these are the fact that in 2007, India was able to elect the first woman president and repeat it in 2022 with the second and our current President of India, Srimati Draupadi Murmu. So this shows that at the topmost level, there is no bar, that there is gender equality at operating, and we have been able to do that. And in Parliament itself, between 2009 and 2019, India had successive two speakers of the Indian Parliament, again running the democratic process within India. So in terms of political empowerment, India has been a leader in terms of gender equality. Now we are seeing new examples of Indian women leading in socio-economic development, in the area of financial technology, in the area of startups and so on. Everything that was focused on during the G20 year that has just gone by has shown the tremendous role of women who have come to the fore. It is now the big challenge for us as a country and as a society is to share this experience of ours with other countries who, as I said, are reeling from the impact of the crisis identified as the pandemic and the outbreak of conflicts. So with this, I think we have much to look forward to, but I would like to, in conclusion, thank Global Order once again for having invited me to address you and deliver the second C.V. Muthamma lecture. Thank you.